Hello and welcome to the Crypto Beat. My name is Kelvin Sparks. This is my co-host, Tim Copeland, head of growth at The Block. Joining us today, we have Azeem Khan, co-founder of Miden. Welcome to the show. How are we all doing?
It is cold in New York right now. And so that's how I'm doing. It's the last week and a half since that snowstorm. I have not been able to get over the fact that it's for the Celsius folks, like negative 20 Celsius on a daily basis. And for the Fahrenheit folks, it's sitting at 10, 11, 12 Fahrenheit with wind chill every single day, constantly.
It's minus 20. That's crazy.
Celsius, yeah, minus 20 Celsius. Exactly. That's why, there's a Fahrenheit and a Celsius listener or a speaker in here. I had to contextualize it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad, even with the dirty snow and whatnot, because New York isn't the cleanest city in the world. But
no, I was in the city yesterday. I almost wore sneakers I had to put on Tim's because I knew it was going to be dirty.
Facts be, as we say around here. I feel you. But on to today's episode. It's going to be privacy focused, and we're going to beg the question, is crypto still cypherpunk? So, Azeem, as we talk about privacy, it almost at some level seems auxiliary to the other things that people care about. So I'm curious, the question was probably to ask, what do people actually care about, and how does privacy play a role in the things that people care about?
I think, to step back a little bit, most people, in my opinion, don't understand crypto well enough to realize that their 0x and then string of numbers kind of thing actually doesn't make them anonymous, and how, Nansen and other companies have found a way to completely commodify what it means to be able to take all this publicly available information online and turn it into something that is a massive surveillance machine in ways that people don't realize. And then also, from so much of what I've seen in the West, which is where we talk a lot about crypto, people are ones that have bank accounts to begin with, and they do a lot of what they want to with crypto sort of on top of that. And so their traditional banking needs are already met. They're paying for their utility bills, their credit card bills. Everything is done regularly. And then they use crypto for the most part, usually on speculation in ways that they want to earn a bunch of money. But if we're going to say that the rails of the next global financial system need to be built on something like blockchain, then it won't be long before people realize just how badly they actually do need privacy. And even, I'll stop there, is that I think that people just don't realize how non-anonymous their transactions are at the moment.
Yeah, this reminded me, I did a really interesting feature when I was in the newsroom in 2023. It was about a legal filing in the Celsius case from 2022. And basically what happened was they released so much information, but they sort of they didn't share the wallets, like the deposit and withdrawal wallets, but they gave such precise information on the transactions that were moved and the exact date stamp or the days that it happened, that you could then work out pretty much everyone's wallets. But this was all tied to real names. So I actually worked with Nansen and our research team, and we actually went through all of it and basically managed to identify about 15,000 real names tied to blockchain wallets.
That's
it was
wild.
Unbelievable how much data was revealed. Just kind of accidentally.
I mean, even on a personal basis, I remember in 2017 when all the ICO stuff was going on, and I was in a bunch of private Telegram groups, and you'd be just chatting with people, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, you bought so and so coin," and I remember back then I was like, "What do you mean? Why do you know?" And they're like, "Well, it's available. You can see how you're doing with that coin." And I think it was just thinking back, being like, "Wait, this doesn't scale well. We can't have this be the case." Or simple stuff without naming blockchains, we're always trying to figure out hey, this is how we can get you to pay for your coffee using crypto. I don't want to pay for my coffee and then all of a sudden people can figure out every single thing that I'm doing transactionally by clicking on Etherscan. And so it's just, we haven't gotten to the place, in my opinion, that it's financial infrastructure enough. Even to politicize it a little bit, let's say, I guarantee there's going to be a story in the New York Times at some point where people are going to be like, "Hey, do you really want it that, your donations to Planned Parenthood can be doxxed, and what that could mean for you? Like, when you're making any sort of donations. And it's like, no. And so there's going to come a time, even though now there's this weird Rorschach test in the West I've noticed where, like the word association, like you mentioned one word and the other word you like throw out. In the West, I've found when you say privacy, North Korea comes up. It's like the immediate word. And so right now, privacy is just bad. Like across the board, privacy is evil. When you go around the world and you say the word privacy, like I was in the UAE for an entire month in December, spoke at Abu Dhabi Finance Week on a panel about privacy and Web3. When you say privacy to them, they hear Swiss bank account. And so just the word association of what's even going on when it comes to the word privacy has been something where I think there's too much emotional charge behind it. And don't get me wrong, North Korea has a large portion of their GDP that's basically tied to being able to steal crypto. I mean, the Bybit hack alone last year for like, what was it, close to $1.5 billion in ETH? I can understand why that's the case, but once people get past that emotionally charged feeling of like, oh, North Korea is laundering money for, an antagonistic nuclear program, we're going to get to the place where people are going to go, wait, like, I don't want every single thing about my finances to be available for anyone to be able to just for use at their discretion.
So then, connotation aside, I'm curious, what does privacy need to get right to look more like traditional payments and scale? Because it seems oftentimes like there's a UX hurdle. So when you use some of these tools, potentially, it's just going to create more and more friction. But at the same time, you don't want all your information out there. How do we end up finding a balance?
I think it's just going to take time. Like if you go back to the 90s, and I think a lot of it starts with like where things are on regulatory things at the moment. But if you go back to the 90s with the internet, like there was a time at which regulators were fighting against like encryption for email and encryption for payments, and the idea of like SSL being added to the internet when people wanted to start making payments. And so if you really think about it, in a sense, it was actually the finance industry sort of who came in and was like, wait, like we do need there to be some sort of encryption if people want to start being able to buy things on the internet. And that didn't happen without difficulty. It happened because there was a large fight where automatically the government assumed like, no, privacy and encryption is a bad thing on the internet. And so it feels like we're in a similar fight again, where we're like, hey, privacy and encryption are good things to have happen. And so with where we're at from the Miden perspective, I see as much as there is a UX problem, so much of it is an educational problem with regulators and sitting down and helping them understand, because there's this underlying belief I find often, at least in the US, which is where I'm based, that like the regulators are bad or evil or something like that. And most of the time, they're just quite uneducated because they're so busy with so many other things that they have to do. And crypto people have this self-importance that like you should understand zero knowledge proofs and anything like that. And you go in to sit down in these rooms with these folks and they're working on a billion things. They have no idea about anything about crypto. And, you know, as you speak to them, they're like, wait, this sounds interesting. And then you realize just how long it takes to actually get bills passed. Like, as an example, 2026 is an election year in the United States for the midterm elections. Historically, if you take a look, almost no bills pass during election years. And so, we're at a place where you can basically assume that the one bill that's going across is the market structure bill at the moment. Let's say it does get passed and there's, a lot of positive sentiment for that, but there's nothing about privacy in that bill. And so you can basically assume that in the entire year of 2026, even though we're sitting here recording on February 3rd, that there will be nothing passed that will support privacy. And so the timelines that are needed to actually get some of these things done, so much of it to me is as much as, the UX hurdles really need to be fixed. Can we get around the idea that regulators will at what point understand that we can use zero knowledge proofs for KYC and AML as opposed to the data aggregation model of creating large stores of KYC and AML the way that things are done now? And what does it take to get them to understand that this is an alternative and better way of doing things? And so in crypto, we end up spending much more of our time, and I think as we should, how can we make this easier? How can we make it faster? How can we make it cheaper? How can we make it better? But to me, especially as someone who's been doing so much in DC over the years, is really what is it that we need to do to get a government official to go, ah, yes, your perfect zero knowledge proof thing is something that I accept, and that I'm willing to sign a bill that says we're okay using this as an alternative method for any of this encryption stuff at the moment.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
politician that surprised me was Nigel Farage. I interviewed him at Zebu Live a few months ago, and he's quite familiar with crypto.
Mm.
He's familiar with Polymarket and some of these sort of platforms. So I like that. That took me a little bit by surprise. But he has been sort of a Bitcoin advocate for a few years now. So like,
He went
yeah.
to, I don't know if you guys remember Zuzalu that Vitalik hosted back in 2023 in Montenegro. Uh, I'm pretty sure because I was there for a portion of Zuzalu. It was like basically a pop-up nation state for a few months in like a very beautiful place where it looked like Bond villains go to hang out like on the yacht harbor, literally. But I'm pretty sure at some point Nigel Farage was hanging out literally at Zuzalu with the folks. So it's not surprising to hear that he's quite plugged in.
Yeah. And then I wanted to ask about something I saw on the timeline, um, which I haven't obviously verified, but they said they deposited 69,420 ETH into the Ethereum Beacon deposit contract from a Tornado Cash address, basically tainting all future transactions. Um,
I didn't see this.
yeah,
I didn't
I
see
don't
this. Interesting.
know. But I was just curious, like, if that did happen, what does that actually impact people from a sort of a withdrawals perspective in terms of like, transactions being tainted?
It's a great question. I don't know. I think. What are you gonna go on that?
I was going to say, it seems like more of a statement as to people's fundamental understanding for how these technologies work and how they should be utilized. Like, obviously, if you're talking about like the beacon chain for Ethereum, this is something that's open and permissionless. You can't really sanction that address, or what good does it do for that? I don't know, like signal wise, it seems like more so that's like a political statement. So, uh, it's interesting though. It's definitely bold. It seems like very Milady-esque, edgy in that sense.
Yeah, just looking into it more, it's the newly relaunched DAO was funded through Tornado Cash. So this was
Oh
the
shit.
funds that they found like the other day that they've like are like reusing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I mean,
I think it goes back again to me to like if you sat down with a regulator who actually has oversight of this, or one of the ones that I've actually really liked is I've sat down with Commissioner Hester Peirce a few times now at the SEC, and have been surprised at how bullish she is on the ideas of privacy and things like that. And if you simply explain to her what this was, I think she would agree that you can't say that that has now tainted everything, but what that means for how they go about codifying that into law is a completely different thing.
and I guess given the statement, maybe a follow up to Tim's question in just the overall episode is, what role does this cypherpunk ethos now play in crypto in 2026? Because it seemed like it was the self sovereignty was the narrative carrying crypto for the first like 10 years, we'll say. Then we had the early stages of institutional adoption. Now nation states are even adopting crypto. So I'm curious, Azim, from your perspective, is straying away from our roots a good thing at this point?
If you go back to the Bitcoin white paper, they talk about like the lack of privacy and how that was going to become exceptionally important because of this like public ledger. I do think that there's the cypherpunk ethos that honestly absolutely still needs to be part of how things are going because usually people don't realize how not private their lives are. And then there are advocates who are out there really fighting on the behalf of people in ways that, like, it's one of those like the heroes we don't even know that are out there fighting for us. And so I do think that the cypherpunk ethos is extremely necessary to protect people from what they don't even understand could be coming their way. I just find that there needs to be a little bit more of an understanding of how to try to sort of win the game that you're trying to win, because there are a lot of cypherpunk people who still argue for basically being able to do things in a way that really just simulates like anarchy. And I mean, as the co-founder of a privacy chain, I'm in a bunch of groups with a bunch of privacy folks, and without naming names, last week there was a conversation where they were having an entire argument with each other over whether or not the cypherpunk ethos is compatible with democracy as a whole. And they concluded that they didn't feel it was compatible with democracy. And so we can't have that be the sentiment that then moves forward to try to have a conversation with FinCEN or the SEC, or understanding how we're going to actually try to figure out how to make this a mainstream thing. At that point, like, it's cool to have your like little technology that isn't going to be able to move forward. But the reality of it is if you do want this to be the way that like the global financial backbone is built on, it's understanding, what is it that we need to do that are going to be, even if there are compromises, it's like, what is it that we can do that actually helps to get us to move forward? And so I do think it's necessary, but I'd say there's a modified version of it at the moment that we need.
Understood. And to that point, as new market participants get involved, how do user requirements for privacy preservation change, maybe at the institutional nation state level?
So I've been fortunate in the past year with Miden. So much of what we're focused on is the idea of compliant privacy. And so since we're offering the idea of compliant privacy, it's been, what does it look like to try to be an institutional grade blockchain trying to do institutional adoption? And so for the past year, I've been having conversations with all of the largest banks, whether in the West or other parts of the world. So the JP Morgans, Morgan Stanleys, Goldman Sachs, Standard Chartered, all of them. And then also having conversations with banks in the Middle East, in Latin America, starting with some stuff in Asia. And so the way we've been seeing it is, it's actually going to be something that we need to figure out first on the regulatory side, while simultaneously excuse me, working with institutions to see what is it that becomes acceptable to them. It's not to say that I'm against the idea of using retail for adoption, but in general, what we've sort of seen for years now, whether talking about like the 2017 ICO, 2021 with all NFTs, 2024 with meme coins, is that using retail to bring people on boards usually requires creating something that's going to be massively speculative in nature and is going to bring you returns that are basically not sustainable in any way, shape, or form. Like, we were talking about Fartcoin before we started the show, and some of the returns that Fartcoin has made for some people, it's just not the way, in my opinion, or in our opinion, that will get true mass adoption going. And so for us, a lot of it has been, as much as the idea of institutional adoption uh, sounds like what everyone wants to do and wants to figure out, right? What are the actual things that are blocking that, and what are the nuances of it? And so, having had conversations with all the regulators, sat with the ADGM recently, I've chatted with the SEC. I'm flying to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan this weekend to be there for about a week and a half before Denver to meet with the central bank, bankers, ministers of finance, to help them understand what it is we're doing. So when we've looked at what it means to actually create adoption, instead of going directly B2C, and instead of sticking at straight B2B almost, we're thinking about what does it look like to do B2B2C. And these large institutions are thinking way more about risk mitigation at the end of the day than anything else. And so sitting with them, really understanding what their issues are, while simultaneously having conversations with regulators to see what it is that is important to them, so that we can even create like sandboxes or pilot environments to do some of these things.
I think this is interesting. I kind of want to harken back to something you mentioned around retail adoption cycles versus like speculative manias. It seemed like in crypto previous cycles, we oftentimes conflated the two. And I think Santiago from Inversion oftentimes talks about this
Mhm.
a lot as well, that we're starting to see a decoupling in that sense. So how is it that you keep retail involved at some level, even though things aren't going gangbusters from a price appreciation side of things?
That's one of the ones that I'd say, I think what Santiago is doing with inversion is actually an excellent idea, because he's basically going around looking at what are businesses that it makes sense to be able to have them go on chain, and what does it look like to basically, and this is my understanding of it, I've never spoken to him about it, but what does it look like to do private equity style purchases and go in, get companies, gut their infrastructure, and then put blockchain in at the back end so that we continue to see more adoption in things that aren't really necessarily speculation? And what does it look like to be able to do that to grow the pie of retail adoption that's occurring? And so it's something that we've actually looked at with Miden as well. And I wouldn't say that we've successfully seen exactly how we want to go about doing it, but I think that in general, I see that as a distribution play. And it's something we think a lot about at Miden in general, because if you think about ecosystem building, so much of it is this bottom up approach where you build something and then hope that it becomes pumped out fun. And what I've appreciated that Santiago is doing is that he's sort of taking it from a top down perspective. And it's been, what are businesses where it makes sense to be able to put blockchain into it? It doesn't necessarily have to be something massively speculative. Let's integrate blockchain into it where there's distribution sort of built in from the beginning. And so it's something that we've been looking at with a couple potential joint ventures that we haven't yet fully signed. But I do think from that perspective, to continue to get use cases in, I think Santiago's head is in the exact right place.
So now to bring it more specifically to privacy tech, and since we were talking about private equity and value accrual, where does the value capture lie for privacy technologies, in your opinion, in 2026?
Oh man, this is interesting. I would say, if I'm being really honest with you, we're actually trying to figure it out in real time. So I'll give you an example. When we first started thinking about what are some of the kinds of applications that should be built on top of Miden, one of the things that we thought that would end up being massively successful would be private OTC. We thought, of course, like everyone would want to be able to do private OTC. And I think it's sort of what happens in crypto is that we create solutions and then go look for problems afterwards. And what we started trying to do is actually have conversations with who we believe our end users will be. And then after that, try to figure out what we should build after. And so we had conversations with what must have been 20, 25 OTC desks. And what we ended up finding was that, weirdly enough, most of them handle things through text messages and Telegram, where they have, and this was like the biggest market makers, everyone. We had no idea that this was the case, but we're also not, finance people. And when we had enough conversations with them, they were like, oh no, we have a trusted network of people. And when we want to do an OTC, we sort of send a message out. We have some Telegram groups, and then we just privately handle everything from there. And so if you did give me something for private OTC, while it seems like maybe it would be interesting, I probably wouldn't use it. And so honestly, a lot of it is like trying to figure out what it is that would be the case. One of the places that we're seeing what could potentially really work out is the private neobank side of things. Everything being like public neobanks has been one of the things where, at least in research so far, we've seen a lot of people would want it. We've added with liquid funds where being able to do dark pools would be something that they're very interested in, because maybe our trading isn't something that we're too worried about people front running or being able to understand. But if you're trading millions or billions of dollars, you do want to be able to have what you're doing as something that's not publicly available for people. So we've seen, just the idea of like dark pool trading being something that's been very interesting to the liquid fund side of things. And so it goes back to the way we're approaching it is, we believe that in the short to medium term, once we go to mainnet, we need to have applications available that sort of small to medium enterprises would use. And then from there is figure out what does it take to do actual institutional adoption, because all of those things, even once you've come to an agreement with a large institution, everyone wants to figure out how to do business with them. But once you've come to a verbal agreement, it takes at least a year to get things actually launched between legal and PR and building things out and signing things. And so in the short to medium term, we've been thinking, OTC desks, market makers, liquid funds, and one of the other ones that's been really interesting in our research was chatting with a lot of projects who've raised between like $5 and $50 million and asking them, hey, like, what do you do with all of your money? And what was fascinating to see was all these crypto companies who've raised a ton of money keep their money in T-bills off chain. They themselves, who are creating and selling products for crypto, don't want to put their money on chain for like simple yield stuff. And so at the moment, a lot of it's been actively trying to figure out what are the things that actually make sense for us to build, as opposed to sort of like the old model of like spray and pray with grants and then just hope that something becomes pump.fun.
Yeah. Although it wasn't long ago, maybe a few months ago now, we saw a huge pump for privacy tokens, Zcash, Monero. What did you make of all that?
To be honest with you, what I made of it was that we're always looking for what's going to be considered some sort of new meta in this industry. Uh, every few months there's something, whether it's AI agents or this or that. There's always something new. And I won't say that it didn't look like a coordinated pump in some capacity. And then being in the industry, there's been a lot of conversations around how it likely was a coordinated pump. I can't confirm any of those things, so I won't go saying it guaranteed was something like that. But if you step back, it's always we need to have a new meta. And Zcash pumping then created a situation where other privacy coins started pumping, and everyone all of a sudden started talking about, well, privacy is the new meta. Where I think that's wrong is that I think privacy is just like a necessary component of actually taking blockchains to mainstream adoption. But what I took it as was just, at least before the slump that we're in now, was it was the new shiny thing that people wanted to chase for 3 or 4 months before they found the next shiny thing.
It was interesting. I thought, to your point around, rather than speculating on what initially caused that pump, was the
Hmm.
beneficiaries of it were a lot of these applications popping up on layer ones that built these privacy preserving pools. I guess one of
Yeah.
them, I'll give them a shout, like a privacy cache was a really interesting one I saw that we're saying, okay, we're going to make these shielded pools on top of Solana because that's where a ton of retail action is. We know people want to buy and sell these assets, but maybe you don't want your friends to know that you're holding a shit coin, for example.
Yep.
So it was interesting to see that kind of trickle out. But to your point around privacy being a meta, when does it just become the standard that privacy is in vogue rather than it being the opposite?
I think that it'll be, again, going back to what we started talking about earlier, is that, privacy is scary right now. Yeah, as a founder of a privacy chain, we have to pay lawyers a lot of money. And even though we're not doing anything that could put us, from what I understand, in a compromising position, like, the unfair trial that Roman Storm ended up facing and being in jail for Tornado Cash for building open source code. At the moment, everyone is just afraid, the idea of just getting regulations for regular blockchain stuff is difficult. When you add privacy to the mix and the extra difficulties and, you know, uh, what is a zero knowledge proof? What are all these other things that the timelines for what it's going to mean to have those things be standard, I think is just a longer timeline. And in crypto, we've become accustomed to the idea that everything should move sort of quickly. And I don't think that that's the case. And especially because most of us take for granted how much we actually know when it comes to this stuff. I was chatting with an executive at one of the centralized exchanges yesterday in the city for lunch, and I was asking him, he was saying that the earn portion of people putting their crypto into their like centralized exchange is something that's actually like one of a massive part of their business. And like a very earnest question from me was, you know, why would people put it into your centralized exchange platform when they could just go on to a DeFi protocol and do it themselves? And they could earn more because you guys are likely making money on the arbitrage of you go do the staking for them and then you take a fee and you give them a smaller portion of it. So why don't people just go out and as someone who's been in and out of crypto since 2012, 2013, to me that seemed like a logical question. And to him, he was like, "Oh, we've done a bunch of user testing, Azim. Most people have zero desire to set up their own wallet. Most of them get confused when you tell them to do bridging. When you explain what a wrapped asset is, it makes no sense to them. And when you get into the idea of signing transactions and all of that, they don't understand the implications of that. And so they just want to sit in a place where they can just like comfortably, just like click, buy, submit, earn. And so I think as a whole, we deeply underestimate just how much education there still is to do on this stuff. And then when you think about what it means to add privacy to the tech, and then on top of it, you think about what it means to have to get like the regulatory side of this done. Realistically, I think, you need to be looking at this from a 3 to 5 year perspective, as opposed to what our industry does, which is I think usually like a 3 to 6 month perspective.
So then, since we have the platform, I guess it's a great time to ask if there were 3 lessons on privacy you think people should be aware of within a crypto context. What are the 3 most important things that come to mind from your perspective?
Well, that's a great question. Uh, that's a great question. The 3 most important thing, I think the first one is basically people just have no idea how important it will be to them. If I was really honest, I think that's okay though. I think that it'll sort of come when it's supposed to. There are projects that are trying to go out of their way to make things that will make this easier for everybody. And so the honest answer is, having them spend more time, speak to their regulators more than anything, like, reach out to your senators and congressmen and tell them that this stuff is important to you. But so much of it is that the tech is being built. It's just going to take time. And so I don't think there really is anything to it other than waiting. I wish that there was. Even as we build stuff out, we're doing partnerships. Last week, we announced something with the largest crypto custodian for institutions in the country of South Korea. And we're going to do an integration with them once we go to mainnet. But, we announced our seed fundraise in April of 2025. And we're looking at going to mainnet in Q2 of 2026. And as anyone who's been in crypto and technology knows, our estimations are likely going to be wrong and it's going to be bumped forward. And we're going to do an integration after we go to mainnet, which will take more months. So to say we announced the seed raise in, Q2 of 2025, and then it's maybe Q1 of 2027, where the integration with this company actually occurs. So much of it is just like patience in the process. I haven't, I don't really have any more insightful things than that. I wish there was, but it's like actually super boring.
No, I think that was well said. I guess the old adage goes, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear, for that matter. So
Yes, yes. I think so. I think so.
if not, we'll go with it. It sounds good enough for the podcast, at least. But Azeem, I do want to thank you for taking the time out today to chat with us in this episode focused on privacy. And as a reminder, our newsroom works tirelessly to get you accurate, informed crypto news. If you want to stay ahead, read the block. Thank you. See you next time.